Ethan Carter had lived in the same quiet neighborhood for nearly 5 years, ever since his wife passed away, leaving him to raise their daughter, Lily, on his own. Life hadn't been easy, but Ethan had built small routines to keep things steady, the kind of ordinary habits that gave Lily a sense of safety. One of those rituals was the evening walk with Max, their golden retriever who had become more than just a pet. He was family, protector, and confidant all rolled into one. Every night, just after dinner, Ethan would slip Max's leash on, call out a goodbye to Lily, and head down the dimly lit streets as his daughter waved from the window, her little face pressed to the glass until he turned the corner. To anyone watching, it looked like a simple, uneventful stroll, a man and his dog taking in the evening air, but for Ethan, these walks carried weight. They were the few quiet moments he had to himself, a chance to reflect on bills piling up on the counter, the challenge of balancing work and parenting, and the constant worry of whether he was giving Lily the childhood she deserved. Max padded faithfully at his side, sometimes nudging Ethan's hand with his wet nose as if reminding him not to give in to despair. It was on one of these ordinary evenings, as the late autumn wind rustled the brittle leaves and the faint smell of chimney smoke filled the air, that something unusual broke the monotony. At the far end of the block stood an abandoned warehouse, a place the neighbors avoided, muttering about how unsafe it was, though no one ever did anything about it. Most nights, Ethan passed it without thought, but that evening he noticed a faint, flickering glow from within, like a lantern or candle struggling against the shadows. At the same time, Max suddenly stopped walking, his ears pricked forward, a low rumble in his throat. Ethan tugged lightly on the leash, but Max refused to move, his entire body tense, focused on the warehouse. A shiver passed through Ethan that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced around the street, everything was quiet, the windows of neighboring houses glowing warmly with families settling in for the night. Everyone assumed he was just out walking his dog, nothing more. No one noticed the way his steps slowed or how his eyes lingered on that trembling light. Ethan crouched beside Max, whispering, "What is it, boy?" But Max only gave a soft whine, pulling ever so slightly toward the building. Ethan straightened, torn between common sense, keep walking, mind your business, and the heavy tug of instinct telling him something wasn't right. The warehouse had always seemed empty, forgotten, yet now it felt alive, holding secrets just beyond that cracked door. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash, his heart beating faster, and took a cautious step closer. He didn't know it yet, but this simple decision, to follow where Max led, would unravel a chain of events that would forever change how the neighborhood saw him, and would test the very core of the quiet life he had tried so hard to build. Ethan's cautious footsteps echoed faintly as he approached the weather-beaten warehouse, its walls covered in peeling paint and creeping ivy that seemed to strangle the life out of the building. Max pulled forward, tail stiff, nose twitching, as if he were certain of what waited inside. Ethan hesitated at the broken doorframe, his breath visible in the cold night air, and then with one steadying exhale, he pushed the door open just enough to slip through. The interior smelled of damp wood and rust, the air thick with dust that floated in the glow of a faint lantern flickering across the room. At first, Ethan thought the place was empty, but then he caught sight of movement in the corner, 2 small figures huddled beneath a torn blanket. They startled when the door creaked, their heads snapping up with wide, fearful eyes that shimmered in the half-light. Ethan's heart clenched when he realized they weren't vandals or squatters, but kids, teenagers at most, a boy and a girl, their faces hollow with hunger and smudged with dirt. They looked like they hadn't eaten properly in days. For a long moment, nobody moved. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or back, while the boy instinctively placed an arm in front of the girl, as if to shield her from a threat. Max broke the silence, padding forward slowly, his tail wagging in cautious reassurance, and after a moment, the girl tentatively reached out, her trembling hand brushing his golden fur. Ethan softened his voice, speaking low and steady, "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The boy eyed him warily, suspicion etched deep in his young face, but hunger and exhaustion had already worn down his defenses. After several moments of silence, the girl whispered, "Please, don't tell anyone." The words cracked like dry wood, fragile and desperate. Ethan knelt, trying to appear less intimidating, and asked how long they had been there. The boy finally admitted they had run away, escaping a home filled with shouting, bruises, and doors slammed in their faces. They had thought they could survive on their own, but instead had ended up in the cold, scared and starving. Ethan felt a heaviness settle in his chest, a deep recognition of their desperation. He knew what it meant to feel cornered by life, to wonder if tomorrow would bring hope or more pain. For a moment, he debated what to do. He could call the authorities and hand them over, but one look at their faces, thin, frightened, and begging for a kindness they hadn't known in too long, made his decision harder. These were just kids, children who had been failed by the very people meant to protect them. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the sandwich he had tucked away for later. He placed it gently on the ground and slid it toward them. Their eyes widened, and the boy snatched it up, breaking it in half to share with his sister. As they ate, Max lay down beside them as if to keep guard, and Ethan knew in that moment that walking away wasn't an option. Ethan walked home that night with a weight on his shoulders heavier than any he had carried in years, Max trotting silently at his side as if sensing his master's turmoil, and when he finally reached his front door, the decision he had been wrestling with became clear: he couldn't leave those children behind. Hours later, after Lily had drifted off to sleep, Ethan returned to the warehouse with a bag of food and blankets, his heart pounding with both fear and conviction, and coaxed the teenagers into following him home despite their reluctance. By the time they stepped into his warm kitchen, their faces lit by the soft glow of the overhead lamp, it was nearly midnight, and Ethan found himself making sandwiches while Max sat loyally at their feet as if he had already accepted them as part of the family. Lily's sleepy footsteps soon padded down the hall, her curious eyes widening when she saw the strangers at the table, and she asked in her innocent voice, "Daddy, are they going to stay with us?" Ethan froze, realizing how impossible the situation was. If the wrong person found out, he could be accused of hiding runaways or worse, but when he looked at Lily's trusting face and the wary, exhausted expressions of the two teens, he forced a smile and said, "Just for a little while." Over the following days, Ethan juggled work, parenting, and the burden of secrecy, slipping extra groceries into his cart, stretching his paycheck thinner, and finding excuses for why the lights in his home burned later than usual. The teens, who introduced themselves as Daniel and Rose, slowly began to trust him, though fear still lingered in their eyes whenever the phone rang or there was a knock at the door. Max became their anchor, curling up beside them at night, offering the kind of comfort words could never provide, and Lily adored them instantly, following Rose around the house and laughing at Daniel's quiet jokes. Yet beneath the fragile sense of safety, Ethan's anxiety grew with each passing day. What if a neighbor grew suspicious? What if someone reported him? What if social services tore the siblings apart instead of helping them? The neighborhood, once so indifferent to his nightly walks, had begun to notice changes: grocery bags heavier than before, unfamiliar shadows moving past the curtains, whispers that Ethan was hiding something. Each time he left the house for work, he carried the gnawing fear that he would return to flashing police lights and Lily's tear-streaked face. But despite the risk, Ethan couldn't bring himself to send Daniel and Rose away. He remembered too vividly the nights after his wife's death when despair pressed against him like a tide, and he had only Lily's small hand and Max's steady presence to keep him afloat. Now, looking at the siblings asleep on the living room couch, curled up together with Max sprawled protectively across their feet, Ethan knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had chosen to protect them, no matter the cost, even if it meant standing against the world. The secret could not stay hidden forever, and Ethan knew it the night his doorbell rang and he opened it to find half the neighborhood gathered on his porch, their faces a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and concern, whispers already swirling that the quiet single dad with the loyal dog was harboring something dangerous behind his closed curtains. Heart pounding, Ethan stepped outside with Max pressed close to his leg and Lily peeking fearfully from behind him, and when the murmurs rose accusingly, claims that he was hiding criminals, that something illegal was happening in his home, Ethan raised his hand for silence, his voice steady though his insides trembled. "You're right," he admitted, shocking them into stillness, "I have been keeping something from you. But not for the reasons you think." At that moment, the front door opened wider, and Daniel and Rose emerged hesitantly, their gaunt faces bathed in the golden glow of the porch light, their arms wrapped around each other like they expected to be dragged away. A hush fell across the group as Ethan spoke again, telling them how he had found the teenagers starving and cold in the abandoned warehouse, how their bruises told stories of pain they were too afraid to repeat, and how no child deserved to be thrown back into that darkness. He confessed that he had taken a risk, not because it was easy, but because he couldn't walk away while 2 children suffered. His words rang raw and honest in the chilled night air, and for a long moment, the neighbors just stared, caught between judgment and shame. Then, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Thompson, the retired teacher who had always fussed about weeds on his lawn, stepped forward first, her voice trembling as she said, "Those kids need help, not more fear. We can do better than just watching." Beside her, Mr. Patel, a nurse from down the street, offered to contact Child Services personally and ensure Daniel and Rose were placed with a safe foster family rather than lost in the system. Slowly, one by one, the anger in the crowd melted into empathy, and what had started as confrontation turned into a promise of support. Tears glistened in Rose's eyes as she whispered to Ethan, "We thought everyone would just turn away again." He crouched to meet her gaze, Max pressing his warm head against her knee, and answered softly, "Not anymore. You're not invisible here." By the end of the night, plans had been made, calls placed, and resources gathered, and for the first time in months, Daniel and Rose allowed themselves to believe in safety. Though they were eventually moved to a nearby foster home, their bond with Ethan, Lily, and Max remained unbreakable. They returned often, not as desperate runaways, but as part of an extended family stitched together by compassion. From that day forward, whenever neighbors watched Ethan and Max take their evening walk, they no longer saw just a man and his dog, they saw a reminder that even the simplest acts of kindness could ripple outward and change lives forever.